where he was, that Hannah felt compelled to apologize. She herself served him, for none of the servants would enter the room. When she came in the first time, she saw him summon his small strength to be prepared for some fearful thing. "Don't be afraid," she begged him softly. "How come? You speak English," he gasped. "I was a long time in America," she replied. She saw that he wanted to reply to that but he could not, and so she knelt and fed him gently from the porcelain spoon. He ate unwillingly, but still he ate. "Now you will soon be strong," she said, not liking him and yet moved to comfort him. He did not answer. When Sadao came in the third day after the operation, he found the young man sitting up, his face bloodless with the effort. "Lie down," Sadao cried. "Do you want to die?" He forced the man down gently and strongly and examined the wound. "You may kill yourself if you do this sort of thing," he scolded. "What are you going to do with me?" the boy muttered. He looked just now barely 17. "Are you going to hand me over?" For a moment Sadao did not answer. He finished his examination and then pulled the silk quilt over the man. "I do not know myself what I shall do with you," he said. "I ought of course to give you to the police. You are a prisoner of war. No, do not tell me anything." He put up his hand as he saw the young man was about to speak. "Do not even tell me your name unless I ask it." They looked at each other for a moment, and then the young man closed his eyes and turned his face to the wall. "Okay," he whispered, his mouth a bitter line. Outside the door Hannah was waiting for Sadao. He saw at once that she was in trouble. "Sadao, Yumi tells me the servants feel they cannot stay if we hide this man here anymore," she said. "She tells me that they are saying that you and I were so long in America that we have forgotten to think of our own country first. They think we like Americans." "It is not true," Sadao said harshly, "Americans are our enemies. But I have been trained not to let a man die if I can help it." "The servants cannot understand that," she said anxiously. "No," he agreed. Neither seemed able to say more, and somehow the household dragged on. The servants grew more watchful. Their courtesy was as careful as ever, but their eyes were cold upon the pair to whom they were hired. "It is clear what our master ought to do," the old gardener said one morning. He had worked with flowers all his life, and had been a specialist too in moss. For Sadao's father he had made one of the finest moss gardens in Japan, sweeping the bright green carpet constantly so that not a leaf or a pine needle marred the velvet of its surface. "My old master's son knows very well what he ought to do," he now said, pinching a bud from a bush as he spoke. "When the man was so near death, why did he not let him bleed? That young master is so proud of his skill to save life that he saves any life," the cook said contemptuously. She split a fowl's neck skillfully and held the fluttering bird and let its blood flow into the roots of a wisteria vine. Blood is the best of fertilizers, and the old gardener would not let her waste a drop of it. "It is the children of whom we must think," Yumi said sadly. "What will be their fate if their father is condemned as a traitor?" They did not try to hide what they said from the ears of Hannah as she stood arranging the day's flowers in the veranda nearby, and she knew they spoke on purpose that she might hear. That they were right she knew too in most of her being. But there was another part of her which she herself could not understand. It was not sentimental liking of the prisoner. She had come to think of him as a prisoner. She had not liked him even yesterday when he had said in his impulsive way, "Anyway, let me tell you that my name is Tom." She had only bowed her little distant bow. She saw hurt in his eyes but she did not wish to assuage it. Indeed, he was a great trouble in this house. As for Sadao, every day he examined the wound carefully. The last stitches had been pulled out this morning, and the young man would, in a fortnight, be nearly as well as ever. Sadao went back to his office and carefully typed a letter to the chief of police reporting the whole matter. On the 21st day of February, an escaped prisoner was washed up on the shore in front of my house. So far, he typed, and then he opened a secret drawer of his desk and put the unfinished report into it. On the 7th day after that, two things happened. In the morning, the servants left together, their belongings tied in large square cotton kerchiefs. When Hannah got up in the morning, nothing was done, the house not cleaned and the food not prepared, and she knew what it meant. She was dismayed and even terrified, but her pride as a mistress would not allow her to show it. Instead, she inclined her head gracefully when they appeared before her in the kitchen, and she paid them off and thanked them for all that they had done for her. They were crying, but she did not cry. The cook and the gardener had served Sadao since he was a little boy in his father's house, and Yumi cried because of the children. She was so grieving that after she had gone, she ran back to Hannah. "If the baby misses me too much tonight, send for me. I am going to my own house and you know where it is." "Thank you," Hannah said, smiling. But she told herself she would not send for Yumi however the baby cried. She made the breakfast and Sadao helped with the children. Neither of them spoke of the servants beyond the fact that they were gone. But after Hannah had taken morning food to the prisoner, she came back to Sadao. "Why is it we cannot see clearly what we ought to do?" she asked him. "Even the servants see more clearly than we do. Why are we different from other Japanese?" Sadao did not answer. But a little later he went into the room where the prisoner was and said brusquely, "Today, you may get up on your feet. I want you to stay up only 5 minutes at a time. Tomorrow you may try it twice as long. It would be well that you get back your strength as quickly as possible." He saw the flicker of terror on the young face that was still very pale. "Okay," the boy murmured. Evidently he was determined to say more. "I feel I ought to thank you, doctor, for having saved my life." "Don't thank me too early," Sadao said coldly. He saw the flicker of terror again in the boy's eyes, terror as unmistakable as an animal's. The scars on his neck were crimson for a moment. Those scars, what were they? Sadao did not ask. In the afternoon the second thing happened. Hannah, working hard on unaccustomed labor, saw a messenger come to the door in official uniform. Her hands went weak and she could not draw her breath. The servants must have told already. She ran to Sadao, gasping, unable to utter a word. But by then the messenger had simply followed her through the garden and there he stood. She pointed at him helplessly. Sadao looked up from his book. He was in his office, the other partition of which was thrown open to the garden for the southern sunshine. "What is it?" he asked the messenger, and then he rose, seeing the man's uniform. "You are to come to the palace," the man said. "The old general is in pain again." "Oh," Hannah breathed. "Is that all?" "All," the messenger exclaimed. "Is it not enough?" "Indeed it is," she replied. "I am very sorry." When Sadao came to say goodbye, she was in the kitchen, but doing nothing. The children were asleep and she sat merely resting for a moment, more exhausted from her fright than from work. "I thought they had come to arrest you," she said. He gazed down into her anxious eyes. "I must get rid of this man for your sake," he said in distress. "Somehow I must get rid of him." "Sadao goes to see the general, of course," the general said weakly. "I understand fully. But that is because I once took a degree in Princeton. So few Japanese have. I care nothing for the man, Excellency," Sadao said, "but having operated on him with such success—" "Yes, yes," the general said. "It only makes me feel you more indispensable to me. Evidently you can save anyone, you are so skilled. You say you think I can stand one more such attack as I have had today?" "Not more than one," Sadao said. Then certainly I can allow nothing to happen to you, the general said with anxiety. His long pale Japanese face became expressionless, which meant that he was in deep thought. You cannot be arrested, the general said, closing his eyes. Suppose you were condemned to death and the next day I had to have my operation. There are other surgeons, Excellency, Sadao suggested. None I trust, the general replied. The best ones have been trained by Germans and would consider the operation successful even if I died. I do not care for their point of view. He sighed. It seems a pity that we cannot better combine the German ruthlessness with the American sentimentality. Then you could turn your prisoner over to execution and yet I could be sure you would not murder me while I was unconscious. The general laughed. He had an unusual sense of humor. As a Japanese, could you not combine these two foreign elements? He asked. Sadao smiled. I am not quite sure, he said, but for your sake I would be willing to try, Excellency. The general shook his head. I had rather not be the test case, he said. He felt suddenly weak and overwhelmed with the cares of his life as an official in times such as these when repeated victory brought great responsibilities all over the South Pacific. It is very unfortunate that this man should have washed up on your doorstep, he said irritably. I feel it so myself, Sadao said gently. It would be best if he could be quietly killed, the general said. Not by you, but by someone who does not know him. I have my own private assassins. Suppose I send 2 of them to your house tonight or better, any night. You need know nothing about it. It is now warm. What would be more natural than that you should leave the outer partition of the white man's room open to the garden while he sleeps? Certainly it would be very natural, Sadao agreed. In fact, it is so left open every night. Good, the general said, yawning. They are very capable assassins. They make no noise and they know the trick of inward bleeding. If you like I can even have them remove the body. Sadao considered. That perhaps would be best, Excellency, he agreed, thinking of Hana. He left the general's presence then and went home, thinking over the plan. In this way the whole thing would be taken out of his hands. He would tell Hana nothing, since she would be timid at the idea of assassins in the house, and yet certainly such persons were essential in an absolute state such as Japan was. How else could rulers deal with those who opposed them? He refused to allow anything but reason to be the atmosphere of his mind as he went into the room where the American was in bed. But as he opened the door, to his surprise he found the young man out of bed, and preparing to go into the garden. What is this? He exclaimed. Who gave you permission to leave your room? I'm not used to waiting for permission, Tom said gaily. Gosh, I feel pretty good again. But will the muscles on this side always feel stiff? Is it so? Sadao inquired, surprised. He forgot all else. Now I thought I had provided against that, he murmured. He lifted the edge of the man's shirt and gazed at the healing scar. Massage may do it, he said, if exercise does not. It won't bother me much, the young man said. His young face was gaunt under the stubbly blonde beard. Say, doctor, I've got something I want to say to you. If I hadn't met a Jap like you, well, I wouldn't be alive today. I know that. Sadao bowed but he could not speak. Sure, I know that, Tom went on warmly. His big thin hands gripping a chair were white at the knuckles. I guess if all the Japs were like you there wouldn't have been a war. Perhaps, Sadao said with difficulty. And now I think you had better go back to bed. He helped the boy back into bed and then bowed. Good night, he said. Sadao slept badly that night. Time and time again he woke, thinking he heard the rustling of footsteps, the sound of a twig broken or a stone displaced in the garden, a noise such as men might make who carried a burden. The next morning he made the excuse to go first into the guest room. If the American were gone, he then could simply tell Hannah that so the general had directed. But when he opened the door, he saw at once that there on the pillow was the shaggy blonde head. He could hear the peaceful breathing of sleep, and he closed the door again quietly. "He is asleep," he told Hannah. "He is almost well to sleep like that. What shall we do with him?" Hannah whispered her old refrain. Sadao shook his head. "I must decide in a day or two," he promised. But certainly, he thought, the second night must be the night. There rose a wind that night, and he listened to the sounds of bending boughs and whistling partitions. Hannah woke too. "Ought we not to go and close the sick man's partition?" she asked. "No," Sadao said. "He is able now to do it for himself." But the next morning the American was still there. Then the third night of course must be the night. The wind changed to quiet rain, and the garden was full of the sound of dripping eaves and running springs. Sadao slept a little better, but he woke at the sound of a crash and leaped to his feet. "What was that?" Hannah cried. The baby woke at her voice and began to wail. "I must go and see," but he held her and would not let her move. "Sadao," she cried, "what is the matter with you?" "Don't go," he muttered, "don't go." His terror infected her and she stood breathless, waiting. There was only silence. Together they crept back into the bed, the baby between them. Yet when he opened the door of the guest room in the morning, there was the young man. He was very gay and had already washed and was now on his feet. He had asked for a razor yesterday and had shaved himself, and today there was a faint color in his cheeks. "I am well," he said joyously. Sadao drew his kimono round his weary body. He could not, he decided suddenly, go through another night. It was not that he cared for this young man's life. No, simply it was not worth the strain. "You are well," Sadao agreed. He lowered his voice. "You are so well that I think if I put my boat on the shore tonight, with food and extra clothing in it, you might be able to row to that little island not far from the coast. It is so near the coast that it has not been worth fortifying. Nobody lives on it because in storm it is submerged. But this is not the season of storm. You could live there until you saw a Korean fishing boat pass by. They pass quite near the island because the water is many fathoms deep there." The young man stared at him, slowly comprehending. "Do I have to?" he asked. "I think so," Sadao said gently. "You understand it is not hidden that you are here." The young man nodded in perfect comprehension. "Okay," he said simply. Sadao did not see him again until evening. As soon as it was dark, he had dragged the stout boat down to the shore, and in it he put food and bottled water that he had bought secretly during the day, as well as 2 quilts he had bought at a pawnshop. The boat he tied to a post in the water, for the tide was high. There was no moon and he worked without a flashlight. When he came to the house, he entered as though he were just back from his work, and so Hannah knew nothing. "Yumi was here today," she said as she served his supper. Though she was so modern, still she did not eat with him. Yumi cried over the baby, she went on with a sigh. "She misses him so. The servants will come back as soon as the foreigner is gone," Sadao said. He went into the guest room that night before he went to bed himself and checked carefully the American's temperature, the state of the wound, and his heart and pulse. The pulse was irregular, but that was perhaps because of excitement. The young man's pale lips were pressed together and his eyes burned. Only the scars on his neck were red. "I realize you are saving my life again," he told Sadao. "Not at all," Sadao said. "It is only inconvenient to have you here any longer." He had hesitated a good deal about giving the man a flashlight. But he had decided to give it to him after all. It was a small one, his own, which he used at night when he was called. "If your food runs out before you catch a boat," he said, signal me 2 flashes at the same instant the sun drops over the horizon. Do not signal in darkness, for it will be seen. If you are all right but still there, signal me once. You will find fresh fish easy to catch, but you must eat them raw. A fire would be seen. Okay, the young man breathed. He was dressed now in the Japanese clothes which Sadao had given him, and at the last moment Sadao wrapped a black cloth about his blonde head. Now, Sadao said. The young American, without a word, shook Sadao's hand warmly, and then walked quite well across the floor and down the step into the darkness of the garden. Once, twice, Sadao saw his light flash to find his way. But that would not be suspected. He waited until from the shore there was one more flash. Then he closed the partition. That night he slept. You say the man escaped? The general asked faintly. He had been operated upon a week before, an emergency operation to which Sadao had been called in the night. For 12 hours Sadao had not been sure the general would live. The gallbladder was much involved. Then the old man had begun to breathe deeply again and to demand food. Sadao had not been able to ask about the assassins. So far as he knew they had never come. The servants had returned and Yumi had cleaned the guest room thoroughly and had burned sulfur in it to get the white man's smell out of it. Nobody said anything. Only the gardener was cross because he had got behind with his chrysanthemums. But after a week Sadao felt the general was well enough to be spoken to about the prisoner. Yes, Excellency, he escaped, Sadao now said. He coughed, signifying that he had not said all he might have said, but was unwilling to disturb the general further. But the old man opened his eyes suddenly. That prisoner, he said with some energy, did I not promise you I would kill him for you? You did, Excellency, Sadao said. Well, the old man said in a tone of amazement, so I did. But you see, I was suffering a good deal. The truth is, I thought of nothing but myself. In short, I forgot my promise to you. I wondered, Your Excellency, Sadao murmured. It was certainly very careless of me, the general said. But you understand it was not lack of patriotism or dereliction of duty. He looked anxiously at his doctor. If the matter should come out you would understand that, wouldn't you? Certainly, Your Excellency, Sadao said. He suddenly comprehended that the general was in the palm of his hand and that as a consequence he himself was perfectly safe. I can swear to your loyalty, Excellency, he said to the old general, and to your zeal against the enemy. You are a good man, the general murmured and closed his eyes. You will be rewarded. But Sadao, searching the spot of black in the twilighted sea that night, had his reward. There was no prick of light in the dusk. No one was on the island. His prisoner was gone safe, doubtless, for he had warned him to wait only for a Korean fishing boat. He stood for a moment on the veranda, gazing out to the sea from whence the young man had come that other night. And into his mind, although without reason, there came other white faces. He had known the professor at whose house he had met Hannah, a dull man, and his wife had been a silly talkative woman, in spite of her wish to be kind. He remembered his old teacher of anatomy, who had been so insistent on mercy with the knife, and then he remembered the face of his fat and slatternly landlady. He had had great difficulty in finding a place to live in America because he was a Japanese. The Americans were full of prejudice and it had been bitter to live in it, knowing himself their superior. How he had despised the ignorant and dirty old woman who had at last consented to house him in her miserable home. He had once tried to be grateful to her because she had in his last year nursed him through influenza, but it was difficult, for she was no less repulsive to him in her kindness. Now he remembered the youthful, haggard face of his prisoner, white and repulsive. Strange, he thought. I wonder why I could not kill him.